August was dying in mud and dampness. The rainy season in Manchuria, which usually brought relief from the summer heat, felt this year like an endless funeral dirge from the heavens. For the 300 Japanese women confined within the walls of the former N-City Girls High School, the rain was just one more humiliation. It seeped through shattered classroom windows, turning dusty corners into islands of mold, its monotonous drumming on the roof tiles drowning out the rumbling of hungry stomachs and the soft weeping in the night. Hanako Tanaka sat by a window, gazing at the blurred silhouette of a guard tower. Her back was as straight as a bamboo stalk, a habit ingrained in her flesh from years of teaching the art of ikebana. Here, in this hell of filth, fear, and despair, she alone tried to maintain her form. Form was everything. It was the frame that kept the soul from collapsing. She was 29 years old. Just 3 months ago, she had been Mrs. Tanaka, the respected wife of an Imperial Army colonel, her home a model of taste and order. Now she was merely number 217, a widow whose only possessions were a worn-out kimono and her memories. And something else, hidden deep in the folds of her obi sash. The cold steel of a short tanto dagger, her husband's last gift. "To protect your honor, Hanako," he had said before leaving for the front. "Honor is the only thing the enemy cannot take, unless you allow it." He was gone now, as was the Kwantung Army, as was the great Japanese empire they had been taught about since childhood. It had all crumbled in a matter of days under the onslaught of Soviet tanks. And now they were here, prisoners of the faceless, bearded giants in faded uniforms, whom propaganda had painted as merciless demons. The classroom, where some 40 women were crammed together, held a heavy stench of unwashed bodies, fear, and the musty straw thrown on the floor for bedding. Next to Hanako, huddled in a ball, shivered young Mieko, the daughter of a silk merchant. Her eyes, huge and moist like a frightened fawn's, were fixed on Hanako. For Mieko and many others, Hanako had become the axis of this collapsing world. She was the only one who didn't cry, who didn't fall into hysterics, who didn't complain. She shared her meager rations with the weakest, taught the girls how to fold their clothes properly to keep them from wrinkling, and in a quiet, even voice, told ancient legends of samurai women. She kept the flame of their dignity alive. "They took Mrs. Sato's rice again," whispered Yuki, settling nearby. Yuki was different, sharp, cynical, with a permanent smirk etched into the corners of her mouth. Before the war, she had worked in an officer's bar and knew more about life than all the noble ladies combined. The old hag tried to trade her jade hairpin for an extra portion. The guard just took the pin and shoved her. She still thinks her family name means something here. Hanako said nothing, only tightened her slender fingers. Mrs. Sato, the wife of a high-ranking official from the colonial administration, still tried to speak to the guards as if giving orders to servants. Every day, reality dealt her a new blow, but she stubbornly refused to acknowledge it. Rumors were their only nourishment, aside from the watery gruel and piece of stale bread. Rumors, each more terrifying than the last, about what happened in other towns, about women taken away at night who never returned, about the cruelty of the victors. Every creak of a door, every loud shout in the guttural foreign tongue made their hearts stop. They lived in a state of perpetual anticipation of the worst. And the worst, it seemed, had drawn near that evening. The classroom door flew open with a bang, and a stubble-faced soldier appeared on the threshold. Behind him stood a gaunt Korean translator they had seen a few times before. "All women of this block," the translator shouted, his voice trembling with fear or cold. "Tomorrow morning, after the morning ration, everyone assemble in the inner courtyard. Everyone. No exceptions. The sick, the old, everyone. The commandant's order." He spoke and vanished, slamming the door behind him. For a moment, a dead silence hung in the room, thick and heavy as a tombstone, and then it shattered. A choked sob from Mieko, a loud wail from a woman in the corner, frightened whispers. Why? What do they want? This is the end. They're going to do what everyone's been whispering about. Maybe they're moving us to another camp. Or to be shot. Hanako stood up. Her movement was fluid and full of grace. She slowly surveyed the terrified, tear-stained faces. In the dim light, her own face looked as if carved from ivory. Quiet, she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it held such steely certainty that the noise instantly died down. The women turned to her, seeking salvation in her calm. We do not know what awaits us tomorrow, Hanako began slowly, articulating each word. Perhaps trials await us, perhaps the most terrible of all. But we are daughters of Yamato. In our veins flows the blood of our mothers and grandmothers who knew how to face fate with their heads held high. They can take our freedom, our food, our homes, but there is something they cannot take: our honor. She placed a hand on her chest, where she could feel the cold outline of the tanto beneath the fabric of her kimono. Whatever happens tomorrow, remember who you are. Do not let fear break your spirit. Meet the morning with dignity. If the time comes to suffer, we will suffer in silence. If the time comes to die, we will die in a way that will make even our enemies ashamed of their cruelty. We are the last remnant of our great nation here, in this foreign land. Let us be worthy of its memory. Her words hung in the stale air. Mieko stopped crying and looked at her with awe. Even on the cynical Yuki's face, something like respect flickered. Almost no one slept that night. The women prayed quietly, sorted through their meager belongings as if preparing for a long journey. Hanako sat motionless by the window, her hand resting on the hilt of her dagger. She was ready. She had prepared them too. Tomorrow, she would show them what it meant to die with honor. The morning was cold and gray. Low clouds clung to the rooftops, shedding a fine, nagging drizzle. The air was heavy and damp, smelling of rotting leaves and smoke from the kitchen chimneys. After a meager breakfast, a ladle of gray, viscous porridge that turned the stomach, guttural shouts from the guards echoed through the barracks. Davai! Davai! To the courtyard! The women emerged slowly, shivering from the damp and fear. They moved as a silent gray mass, united by a common terror. The old leaned on the young. Mothers clutched the children who remained with them even tighter. Hanako walked in the middle of this procession, upright and focused. Her face was an impenetrable mask. She felt Mieko walking beside her, trembling all over, and reassuringly touched her shoulder. The school's inner courtyard, once filled with children's laughter, was now a trampled, muddy patch of ground surrounded by barbed wire. Soldiers with rifles stood along the perimeter. Their faces were impassive, their gazes sliding over the women without any expression. No malice, no lust, just bored indifference. This indifference was more frightening than open hostility. 300 women huddled into a dense, trembling crowd in the center of the courtyard. The rain intensified, its cold drops running down their faces, mixing with the tears of those who could no longer hold back. They waited. Every second of waiting stretched into an eternity, filled with the most terrible fantasies. Finally, an officer emerged from the commandant's office, tall, broad-shouldered, in a neatly buttoned tunic with a major's insignia. It was the commandant, Major Voronov. Hanako had only seen him once, fleetingly. He had the tired, weathered face of a man who had spent years at war. His light eyes were cold and distant. He didn't look like the monster from the propaganda posters. He looked like a man doing an unpleasant but necessary job. The familiar Korean translator scurried beside him, pale and drawn. The major said something to him, short and sharp. The translator flinched as if struck and stepped forward. He surveyed the crowd of women, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. An absolute silence fell. The only sounds were the patter of rain on the mud and the distant whistle of a locomotive. "Order from the commandant." The translator's voice cracked, turning into a pathetic squeak. He cleared his throat and repeated louder, "An order. All women. Prepare for sanitary processing." A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd. Sanitary processing? What did that mean? Major Voronov waved his hand impatiently. The translator shrank and blurted out the next sentence like a machine gun burst, trying not to look the women in the eye. "Everyone is to strip to your undergarments. Place your clothes in a pile in front of you, then wait for further commands." If a lightning bolt had struck the center of the courtyard, it would have had less of an effect. The murmuring ceased instantly, replaced by a deathly silence, and then by a wave of horror that shot through the crowd like an electric shock. This was it. The beginning. The insidious, humiliating beginning of the end. Sanitary processing. What a cynical euphemism. Mrs. Sato let out a choked groan and began to sink to the ground. The women next to her caught her. Mieko clung to Hanako's sleeve with such force that her knuckles turned white. Her face was distorted with terror. "Hanako-san, Hanako-san," she whispered, breathless. Hanako did not look at her. Her gaze was locked on Major Voronov. She searched his eyes for triumph, cruelty, anticipation, but she found nothing. Only cold impatience, as if he were commanding the unloading of freight cars, not hundreds of humiliated women. The soldiers around the perimeter raised their rifles, adopting a more menacing stance. The translator, seeing the hesitation and feeling the major's icy gaze on him, screamed almost hysterically, "Obey! Immediately!" And he paused, gathering his courage, and uttered the phrase that became their sentence. "Do not resist. Resistance will be suppressed. Do not resist." Those 3 words struck Hanako like a whip. This was it, the moment of truth, the moment she had been preparing for. Her fingers found the cold, ribbed hilt of the tanto under her clothes. Her heart hammered against her ribs, beating a frantic rhythm. Blood rushed to her face. Around her, movement began. Some women, numb with horror, began to mechanically, like dolls, untie the sashes of their kimonos. Others sobbed aloud, falling to their knees in the mud. Still others just stood, paralyzed by fear. Hanako remained motionless. She was ready. Her husband had taught her. There are humiliations after which life is impossible. This was one of them. Now she would take a step forward. She would draw the dagger. Perhaps she would make it to him. Perhaps not. It didn't matter. What mattered was the act, the protest, the refusal, the final act of will of a free woman in the face of inhuman force. Her death would be an example to the others. They would see that it was possible not to submit. That one could choose death over shame. She took a breath, preparing to charge. Her eyes met Major Voronov's across the wet curtain of rain. And in that instant, a fraction of a second before the fatal step, she saw something strange in his eyes. Not lust, not cruelty, but just a flicker of bewilderment, as if he genuinely didn't understand why these strange women were reacting this way to a completely routine order from his point of view. This momentary discrepancy, this crack in the monolithic picture of expected horror, threw her off. It slowed her reaction, and into that pause, a new order cut through the air. "First group, into the laundry building. Quickly!" one of the guards barked, prodding the hesitating women with his rifle butt. They were not being led to dark basements or soldiers' barracks. They were being herded into the single-story brick building of the former camp laundry. The laundry door opened, releasing a dense cloud of steam and a sharp, nose-stinging smell of carbolic acid and chlorine. It was not the smell of death or lust. It was the sterile, impersonal scent of a hospital, of disinfection. The discrepancy between expectation and reality was so jarring it was disorienting. Inside were not leering soldiers, but a half-dozen stern-looking Soviet women in white coats, their hair tucked under scarves. One of them, a woman with tired but intelligent eyes and a doctor's insignia, seemed to be in charge. This was Dr. Elena Petrova. The room was filled with equipment that made no sense in the context of their fears. Metal tubs filled with a murky, foul-smelling liquid, shears for cutting hair, and makeshift shower heads mounted on the walls. The Japanese women, pushed inside in groups of 20, stood frozen. Their minds, braced for a battle of honor against brute force, couldn't process this new scene. The atmosphere was not one of violent passion, but of cold, clinical efficiency. This was not a stage for martyrdom. It was an abattoir for germs. Dr. Petrova spoke in a calm, professional tone to the translator, who then relayed her words. "The doctor says there is an outbreak of typhus in the region," he announced, his voice now more confused than frightened. "This is a mandatory procedure to prevent an epidemic in the camp. It is for your own health and the health of everyone here." The words were meant to be reassuring, but they had the opposite effect. They were so logical, so mundane, that they felt like the cruelest mockery. They had prepared their souls for a grand, tragic finale, and instead, they were being lectured on public health. The procedure began. The Soviet medics were rough, but not malicious. They were efficient. Women who hesitated or cried were held firmly by 2 medics, while a third unceremoniously sheared off their long, beautiful hair, which fell in dark heaps on the wet floor. Each snip of the shears was a snip at their identity. Mrs. Sato, when her turn came, shrieked and fought like a wild animal. She was subdued with impersonal strength, her hair shorn, her body scrubbed raw before she was shoved under a stream of cold water, emerging a sputtering, broken creature stripped of her last shred of dignity. Then it was Hanako's turn. She stepped forward, her body rigid with a control that was costing her everything. She stood before Dr. Petrova. The 2 women looked at each other. The Soviet doctor, a servant of science and military orders, the Japanese aristocrat, a servant of tradition and honor. Worlds collided in that gaze. Mieko, who had gone just before her, stood shivering nearby, her head shorn, tears streaming down her face, looking at Hanako as if pleading with her to do something, to perform the miracle of resistance she had promised. Dr. Petrova motioned towards the showers, then made a gesture for Hanako to remove her remaining undergarments. This was the final threshold. Hanako didn't move. She clutched the thin fabric at her chest. This was a line she could not cross. Her body was the temple of her honor, her husband's memory. The cold steel of the tanto pressed against her ribs, a silent promise. She could still act. She could still choose. "The doctor says it is necessary for the treatment," the translator's voice droned on. "Please, do not resist. Do not resist." The words echoed in the steamy, carbolic air, no longer a threat of violation, but a tiresome, clinical instruction. A nurse tells a child not to resist a needle. A farmer tells an animal not to resist the dip. The phrase was utterly devoid of the terrible significance Hanako had given it. And in that moment, standing before the impassive doctor, with the smell of disinfectant burning her nostrils and the sound of sobbing women all around, Hanako Tanaka understood. The epiphany was not a flash of light, but a wave of absolute cold that extinguished every fire within her. The horror was not that they were going to dishonor her. The horror was that her honor was not a factor. It wasn't on their ledger. They were not conquering her spirit because they were not aware she had one. She was not an enemy to be broken, a woman to be shamed. She was a potential carrier of pediculus humanus corporis, a biological specimen, her grand, noble death, the dagger, the final defiant act to be remembered for generations. It was all a fantasy, a play she had written and rehearsed in her mind, for which the other actors had never shown up. To draw her tanto now would be absurd. It would be the act of a mad woman swatting at a surgeon's scalpel. They wouldn't see it as a defense of honor. They would see it as a hysterical, unhygienic disruption of a necessary procedure. This was true helplessness. Not the powerlessness of the body against overwhelming force, but the powerlessness of the soul against absolute indifference. To be unable to fight your enemy is one thing. To realize your enemy doesn't even see you as worthy of a fight is another. It was a spiritual annihilation. The strength drained from her limbs. The hand that had been tensed, ready to draw the blade, went limp at her side. Her spine, always so straight, seemed to lose its rigidity. She looked at Dr. Petrova, and for the first time she saw not an adversary, but simply another woman doing a job. A tiresome, dirty job. Slowly, mechanically, Hanako's hands moved. She untied the final knot of her undergarments. They fell to the wet floor. She stood naked, but she felt no shame. Shame required an audience that judged you by a shared code. Here, there was no shared code. There was only the cold, impersonal gaze of sanitation. She was an object being cleaned. She walked towards the shower, her movements robotic. The cold water hit her skin, but she barely felt it. Her eyes were open, staring at the brick wall, but she saw nothing. The moment of her greatest emotional climax was not one of defiance or agony, but of profound, terrifying emptiness. Her soul had been disarmed, not by force, but by indifference. After the dousing in foul-smelling liquid in the cold shower, they were handed rough, gray institutional smocks. The fabric was coarse against their raw skin. Their own clothes, their kimonos and undergarments, the last symbols of their individual identities, their status, their lives before this, were thrown into a pile to be taken away and boiled, or perhaps burned. When Hanako's group was herded back into their classroom, the atmosphere had changed completely. The tense, fearful energy of the morning was gone. It was replaced by a stunned, hollow silence that was far more unnerving. The air was still thick with the smell of chlorine that clung to their skin and hair. The women sat on their straw mats, transformed into a uniform mass of gray figures with shorn heads. The reactions varied. Yuki, ever the pragmatist, shrugged. "Well," she said to no one in particular, her voice raspy, "at least we won't have lice." Mrs. Sato sat in a corner, rocking back and forth, staring into space. She had been stripped of her fine kimono, her elaborate hairstyle, her family name, everything she was. She was a ghost. Mieko, shivering, huddled next to Hanako, seeking the comfort she had found there before. But Hanako was no longer a pillar of strength. She was a shell. She stared at the rain-streaked window, her gaze distant and unfocused. Later, as she numbly arranged her new smock, something small and hard fell out from the folds of the old kimono she had managed to keep near her. It was the tanto. It clattered softly on the wooden floor. She picked it up. The lacquered hilt, the polished steel. It felt impossibly heavy in her hand. Yesterday, it had been a symbol of her ultimate power, her agency, her final, unassailable freedom. It was the key to an honorable death. Now, it looked like a theatrical prop, a child's toy. Its meaning had been bled out of it in the antiseptic steam of the laundry. To use it now would be like trying to perform a tea ceremony in the middle of a slaughterhouse. Pointless. Irrelevant. She didn't throw it away. With the last flicker of her old habits, she carefully wrapped the dagger in a scrap of cloth and hid it again at the bottom of her meager bundle. But its purpose was forever changed. It was no longer a weapon to defend her honor. It was a memento of a world that no longer existed. It was the tombstone of a self that had died that morning, not from a blade, but from a realization. The years passed. The rain over Manchuria gave way to snow, and then to a fragile spring. The war became a memory, a scar on the face of the world. Mieko was repatriated to Japan in 1946. She married a quiet shopkeeper and raised 2 children. She worked hard to build a normal life, to bury the past under layers of domesticity. But sometimes, in the bath, the smell of a certain kind of soap would catch her off guard, and she would be overcome by a wave of inexplicable shame, a feeling of being fundamentally unclean that she could never articulate to her husband, or even to herself. Yuki, the cynic, used her sharp survival instincts to navigate the chaos of post-war Japan. She opened a small bar in the ruins of Osaka, catering to American soldiers and local black marketeers. She grew hard and successful. She rarely, if ever, thought about the camp or the delousing. It was just one of many unpleasant things one had to endure to stay alive. To her, survival was the only honor that mattered. Mrs. Sato never recovered. Stripped of the status that had been her entire identity, her spirit withered. She refused to eat, convinced the food was poisoned or beneath her. She died in the camp infirmary 2 months after the sanitary processing, not from typhus, but from a profound and incurable ailment of the soul. Her official cause of death was malnutrition. Hanako also returned to Japan. She lived a quiet, solitary life in a small town by the sea, working as a seamstress. She never taught ikebana or calligraphy again. The pursuit of form, which had once been the center of her universe, now felt hollow and false. She never married again, never sought to rebuild the life she had lost. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, she would unwrap the small tanto. She would run her thumb over the cold steel, not with the resolve of a warrior, but with the detached curiosity of a historian examining an artifact from a lost civilization. The dagger was no longer a comfort or a threat. It was a reminder of the moment she learned the deepest kind of helplessness. Not the inability to fight an enemy, but the devastating realization that the enemy does not even see a fight worth having. The moment she understood that a soul can be disarmed more completely by indifference than by any weapon on earth,